So we're looking here at chapter 13. This is a bit difficult. As I was reading this chapter a couple times, I was thinking to myself, "Oh my, what have we gotten ourselves into?" I'm giving this to the students. Will they come back? And I think that we should say at the outset, if they don't get everything in this chapter, that's okay.
Yeah.
We're not going to give a test on this chapter. We're asking for a summary.
Okay.
So it's what they understood, and we're trying to help them understand it. Nevertheless, I think this will still push them, and I want it to push them.
Yeah. It surely pushed me.
Good. It pushed me sometimes too, and I was like, okay, what's he saying? A few paragraphs I wrote TML. Too much Latin. And like, okay, let's just not use the Latin. It'll be a little bit easier. But it reminded me over the summer, we went camping in Colorado, and my kids climbed a couple mountains, and we had been kind of planning it, and they made it to the top, Pikes Peak, 14,000 feet, pretty high. Afterwards, they said that it was harder than they thought, and they had already anticipated maybe not making it, but yet they realized that they had more in them than they thought they did. And I think hopefully the students will have the same experience where, okay, this is harder than I thought, but yet they might have a little bit more in them to understand these things than they thought they did.
Yeah.
That's the goal. So we have Christological formulation, the Orthodox identity of Jesus Christ. And this is one of the two more summary chapters where he kind of brings things together. And so, one of, I think, the challenges of this chapter is you've just got so many ideas that he's already laid out there that are just kind of coming together. And it sort of, ends up being kind of abstract because he's just picking these things and pulling them together. But I think really, really, really good. And we'll read some sections here and just try to help understand it. But I think if I could just orient us to what this chapter is doing overall. So where is it here? Yeah, he quotes Scott Swain, who's a great theologian. I've appreciated him. And he says here, so this is page 433, and he has quoted this same thing earlier. But here's what essentially is going on in this chapter. This quote sums it up. Jesus is the Son, living out in human form his eternal relationship with the Father and the Spirit for our saving benefit. That's what he's explaining here. Let's just read it again. Jesus is the Son, so that ontological starting point. The person is the Son, living out in human form his eternal relationship with the Father in the Spirit. So we have to have a Trinitarian understanding of this whole thing. What he's doing, Jesus is interacting with humans, with us. He interacts with people when he comes, and still interacts with us now, but he's also interacting with the Father. And in some sense, that's the more basic, primary interaction.
Yeah.
He's living all out before the Father. The end of John 17, the prayer. He's obeyed the Father in all things. So Jesus is interacting with the Father. He's carrying out that relationship with the Father in human form for our saving benefit. And that brings in the redemptive historical perspective that this is the Son of God come in the flesh to redeem humanity. So exactly. We have to keep all of those things, triangulate those things. The ontological priority of the sonship, who he is as Son, the Trinitarian dynamic that he is the Son in human form, living, interacting with God, and then the salvific goal of that he is doing it for our benefit, for our salvation. And just I think that's what's going on in this chapter. So if we get lost, at least let's realize where the destination is. And we might not see how every single thing contributes that way, but if we have a sense of what the purpose is doing here, And he's a good writer, so he is keeping his purpose
Yeah.
the whole way through. At least if we understand that purpose, we can kind of helps us see how each argument is getting there.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Chris.
Is that? Do you agree? Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense that there is an eternal relationship. There's an eternal relationship that Jesus Christ had with the Father and with the Holy Spirit. So the Trinitarian dynamic that you had mentioned, and that is continuing as Jesus Christ, God the Son, incarnate in his human form for the purpose of our saving benefit. I thought what you said made perfect sense.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and he's quoting Scott there, and that helps. Okay, so we have all these great words here. One extra homework assignment could be take some of these words and use them in ordinary conversation, right? So a challenge: use metaphysics and economy in this sense. When you're talking to your friends, try it. See what happens. Okay, so we have the subject of the incarnation, 3 sections: the subject of the incarnation, the metaphysics of the incarnation, and then the economy of the incarnation. Those are the 3
major sections of the chapter.
And let's start with the subject of the incarnation. The Word became flesh, and now we have this wonderful nature-person distinction.
Exactly. Yeah, which is critical in formulating our Christology. Is being able to understand these terms. What is the nature? What is the divine nature? And what is the human nature? And as well as being able to understand who the person is. Right. The active subject.
Right.
That being the person.
Right.
And
you're not going to understand the divine nature, human nature distinction unless you understand what a nature is.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And so being able to just really process and digest kind of what Wellum is saying here it's really important, because if you're able to get this I think it's the second paragraph on page 424, you're able to really understand this section and this portion of this chapter, really helps and guides you as you're reading kind of the entire, for the next 2 chapters.
Yes.
13 and 14.
Yeah.
The distinction between the person and nature.
Right. Yeah, it's helpful bringing in history here, because I think history helps explain how things emerge. The nature person or essence person distinction first really developed in Trinitarian theology, because we're trying to understand the person, the persons of the Godhead in distinction between the one God. So God is one essence and 3 persons. In how we in that language, nature, person, sort of developed in that sense. And then those terms became extremely helpful in applying to Christology, because you have a contrast, whereas the Trinity is one nature and 3 persons. The person of Christ is one person and 2 natures. So it's kind of flip-flopped. And I think that's just sort of helpful. They're kind of like mutually, they define one another. You understand, okay, here's how the Trinity is different than the person of Christ. The Trinity is one nature in 3 persons. Christ is one person in 2 natures. And so the way this is scholastic theology. This is where scholastic theology is really trying hard to make clear distinctions. A nature deals with what a thing is. A person deals with who, right? Bottom of page 424. A nature does not act. A person acts through a nature, never vice versa. In the incarnation, then, the person of the Son, who subsists eternally in the one divine nature, acted to assume a human nature. So the act of the person of the Son is to assume a human nature. So he takes on a human nature, and that's that's an incredibly important distinction.
Yeah.
And it's important that we not fall for what he calls the social Trinitarianism that looks at person, as he says here, as, quote, a distinct center of knowledge, will, love, and action. Whereas the person is dealing with the will, but rather looks at the will as residing in the nature, is the better way to do that. Yeah. And then, later on, we 425 towards the end, the heading, the classical understanding of person, he talks about Boethius and his definition, an individual substance of a rational nature. That's what the person is. So the idea of a subsistence or person, those are just synonyms, is the idea of the actual material thing, the person. That's what we mean by the person, though. The I, the acting subject, the agent who is the person acting. That is the person. Whereas the nature is the nature through which the subject acts.
Yeah.
So we are a person acting through our human nature, and that's the way to understand that distinction. Herman Bavinck is really good on this, and I actually went and read his section, and that clarified some things for me too.
Okay.
But top of page 426, Herman Bavinck provides a good summary here. A person is the owner, possessor, and master of a nature, a completion of existence, sustaining and determining the existence of a nature. The subject that lives, thinks, wills, and acts through nature with all of its abundant content, by which nature becomes self-existent and is not an accident of another entity. What makes me different than another human nature?
Yeah.
That it is me as a person acting through my human nature.
Exactly.
That individualizes who I am.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then this section here, page 426, I wrote down, this is important but hard. He says, in addition, this is the first full paragraph on page 426, in addition to the distinction between person and nature, we must also distinguish between divine and human persons. Historically, theology has maintained that the categorical difference between the Creator and its creatures prevents a univocal relationship between divine and human persons, but allows an analogical comparison. The divine person is the archetype, the human person is the ectype. Divine and human persons, then, are necessarily similar and necessarily dissimilar. There is continuity and discontinuity between these metaphysical realities. What basically it's saying there, I just gave that illustration of what a person is by illustrating it about me, right? I acting through my nature. Now, but wait a minute, we're trying to explain the Son of God. How can I use, talking about me and how I act through our nature, how can that explain who the Son of God is? Well, because there's an analogical relationship between the divine person and human persons.
Yeah.
So I don't say that if I want to understand what a person is, I start with myself, understanding if I want to understand who the divine person is, I don't start with myself and look at personhood in terms of human personhood. I must start with God. Nevertheless, there is an analogical relationship because we are created in God's image.
Exactly.
So that gives us the right to apply the same terms, divine person, human person. And kind of understand what it is. It's a communicable quality there, even though we must assert that we're not talking about exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and this is because the divine person, as he says, is the archetype, is the original, and the human person, the archetype, is the copy,
right,
so to speak, right? So there is that continuity because we are created in the image of God. However, there's a discontinuity because we're not God.
Right.
There are certain aspects of his nature, the incommunicable, the traits that cannot be easily spoken or communicated, his the fact that he's eternal, the fact that he's omniscient, the fact that he's omnipotent. So there's a similarity, there's an analogy between the two persons. However, there's a discontinuity. There's distinction between the two as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And this needs to be preserved. Right. At the same time, this needs to be understood so that we understand who Christ is as a person operating in two natures. At the same time, it needs to be preserved because it allows us to logically and coherently present our case for the deity and humanity of Christ and how those two.
If you can't get the person nature distinction, then things are not going to make sense. Then we'll end up in a complete contradiction. Now page, and we're still dealing with the Son. Keep us back. What is this talking about? It is who the Son is, right?
Yes,
we're dealing with the subject, right? Because remember that phrase. What we have going on here is Jesus the Son living out in human form his eternal relationship with the Father in the Spirit for our salvation. And we're dealing with the subject. Jesus is the Son. So we're dealing with the nature of that Son. What it is that we're actually talking about. So he talks about the difference between nature and persons. The person being who, the nature being what. In order to make the point that, actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Then we have a discussion about the Trinity, right? So page 429, the divine persons and their relations. So here, what we're doing here is that if we're going to talk about the Son being incarnate, we have to understand the Son in relationship to the Father and the Spirit. So again, we're talking about the acting subject, who it is who is incarnate. He is the Son of God. But if I want to understand the Son, I need to understand the Son in relationship to the Father and to the Spirit. The relationship, the intertrinitarian relationship between the persons is how we distinguish the persons. So who is the Son? He is the Son of the Father, and he has a relationship of being the Son to the Father. That's how we understand who the Son is and what makes the Son different than the Father. Because if we just look at the individual persons of the Godhead, we realize that they all share the same nature, so they all have the same attributes. Nevertheless, they are individualized as persons because of their relationship with each other. And if that's the case, then that we understand each individual person in relationship to the other person, the other persons of the Trinity. If we want to understand the Son, we must understand the Son in relationship to the Father and the Spirit. And that's also critical because then when we look at who the Son is, as he is acting in the world, as we watch him act in the world, we understand that he is still acting, as we said before, in relationship to the Father and the Spirit. He is obeying his Father because he is the Son. In coming to the world, and everything that he's doing is obeying his Father. That's why it's inappropriate to talk about kenosis as a temporary limitation of Christ in obedience to his Father, because he's always the Son. So he always, does what the Father has willed him to do. There is always this eternal relationship of being the Son to the Father. That doesn't just happen for the incarnation and then maybe disappear later.
It has always exists. And I think the bottom of page 430 really summarizes, at least highlights how that relationship between the Son and the Father looks like. Wellum says that the Father initiates and acts through the Son and in the Spirit. The Son obeys the Father and works in the Spirit. The Spirit executes the acts of the Father and the Son in power. So we see how that relationship is and what it looks like. And this has existed prior to the incarnation and is continuing through the incarnation.
Right. The incarnation is a manifestation
Exactly.
of that relationship.
Exactly.
It doesn't constitute that relationship. I
bumped the table. Sorry,
it's okay.
guys.
No earthquake going on. Everything's good. The incarnation does not constitute the relationship of Father-Son. The incarnation manifests the
Yes.
relationship of the Father and Son. That's
Yes.
an important distinction
Yeah.
in order to make there. And what this is also getting at is that page 431, top of the page, the Son alone became incarnate because it was fitting for his unique filial, that is relating to the Son, mode of subsisting in the divine nature in relationship to the Father and the Spirit.
So it made sense.
Yeah, it wasn't arbitrary
Yeah.
that the Son was the one who became incarnate and not the
Father
Holy
or
Spirit
the
or the
Spirit.
Father, because it was there is this relationship where the Son executes the Father's will. We see that in creation, and we also see that here too in the incarnation. That's manifesting that relationship. Yeah. Well, this is tough stuff, but I think I'm just encouraged as we're talking about it too.
Yeah,
this is the divine nature. This is who God is.
It begins to make sense.
Good.
As you try to really, as I said, articulate our belief and understand who Jesus is and how is it that he is both the fully divine and fully human. As you really try to really lay out and outline how that looks, it's kind of through understanding the Trinitarian relationship, and it's through understanding how he is one person in the Trinity who is subsisting in two natures, both the divine nature and the human nature, right? It's one person in two natures. That's why he's able, in his fully human and flesh form, he's able to, Wellum hints, he's able to say, I am God, right? He said, before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah.
He's able to say that as a human because his divine nature is still present. His person is still. I'm living in the human nature.
Yeah. The priority on the person means it is the person who assumes the human nature.
Exactly.
Right. And that gets we should move quickly to the for the sake of time to the economy. The section on the metaphysics is very short. Metaphysics, that word is meta, above, physics, meaning the physical. So the metaphysics of the incarnation is just describing what's going on here in the incarnation, sort of the how this happened. Page 433, where that section starts, just say one quick thing about it, and that is the incarnation is an act of addition, not subtraction. So he doesn't get rid of his divine nature. He keeps the divine nature because it is the divine person of who is becoming incarnate. But he adds the human nature such that he then, as that person, can act through that nature. Yeah. It is not addition. It is an act of addition, not subtraction. Yeah. And then we can add, and we'll talk about this in class, but look at, well, how is that act of addition a humbling thing? How is it that when he adds something to his to himself metaphysically, he is humbling himself? How is that an act of humiliation, according to Philippians 2? And Bruce Ware gives a great illustration on this. He says, let's say I went and tried to test drive a car, a nice, really, really, $100,000 car or whatever. A car I'd probably never drive. Let's say I went to test drive that. Went with all the rain, went through all these mud puddles, brought the car back to the place, and they're like, "Oh, what did you do to the car?" And then you say, "Well, I didn't take anything away from the car. I just added to it." I added mud. Yes. Get mud in there on the interior. I didn't take away from anything, and that's true, right? You didn't take away anything from the car. The car is still 100% of what it was before.
Yeah.
You just add to it, which does diminish the outward display of the car's luster, of the car's glory.
Yeah.
And that's what the incarnation did too. The incarnation took away, this is Bruce Ware's illustration, I think it's good. It didn't take away anything from the divine person, but in adding human nature, that is an act of humiliation.
Absolutely.
He humbled himself, taking on the form of a servant. That taking on the form of a servant is an act of humiliation. It's an addition to himself, but it's an addition that is a humbling aspect to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what it's getting at here in this section. The divine person of the Son subsists forever in the divine nature and in a full and sinless human nature. So that's just getting at how there's this now two natures of Christ. And then he talks about the hypostasis and anhypostasis, and the point there to make is simply that there is no person of the human nature. It's not as if there is a divine nature and a human nature, and each have a person that is an acting subject attached to them, and that they're fused together. It is not a union of two persons, a human person and a divine person. It is rather the divine person taking on the human nature that is unpersonalized. Yeah. There's no acting subject of that human nature until the divine nature assumes it. And then when the divine nature assumes that human nature, or the divine person assumes the human nature, it is the divine person who is the acting subject of that nature.
Yeah. It's impossible to have two persons.
Right.
That acting subject is what makes us unique as an individual.
Right.
It kind of the same thing when it comes to thinking of Jesus Christ, is that the person, this second person Trinity, God the Son, is a person. So he's not becoming somebody else or fusing with someone else to become Christ, God the Son incarnate.
Yeah, like a third thing.
Yeah, he's God the Son still. But he's just assuming this kind of human nature in its human form.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Otherwise, we would have a schizophrenic Christ.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Then we would have two persons.
Yeah.
And
two active subjects.
Yeah. And that's not what we have at all. So now, okay, moving on then to the economy of the incarnation. How do we understand this working out? And we get the point. I think the goal here is to preserve the fact. On page 436, middle paragraph. When Jesus speaks, thinks, wills, and acts, he does so as the eternal divine Son. Mm-hmm. We want to preserve that fact,
yes,
and yet recognize that when he speaks, acts, wills, he's doing it such that it is in human form. Yeah. Such that it is a human action. Yeah. Earning human righteousness, tempted in all ways like us. So, that's the goal, is to preserve both of those, not go off the rails on either one. Preserve the divinity of the person and yet the true human actions. And again, some of this stuff here is probably the most difficult. I don't know. Would you agree? Is this section the most difficult, or do you think the person-nature distinction earlier on was more difficult?
No, that one was difficult. I think I eventually got it when I eventually got the person-nature distinction a little later as I was reading, to be honest. Yeah. And then I read this section again. I was like, oh, that's what he was really trying to say.
Right.
But yes, this section is definitely tough.
Yeah.
Definitely tough.
Yeah. So we have the communicado again for homework. Use communicado idiomatum. in casual conversation and see what happens. It might not be good. What is the communicado idiomatum? It is the communication of the attributes, how we understand the divine nature and the human nature interacting in the person of Christ.
Yeah. And he said, in each nature retain its own attributes and integrity.
Yes.
Maintaining that distinction, the creator-creature distinction,
Right.
even in the hypostatic union of deity and humanity. So in other words, Christ's divine nature is reserved,
Right.
even as he became God the Son incarnate, and his human nature was preserved as well. So therefore, you do have that God versus human distinction as being preserved, even though God and man, even though Jesus Christ became God and man.
Right.
So
right.
you just have to understand and know that each nature is preserved in its manifestation as God does, as Jesus Christ, God's
Right.
Son.
Right. Yeah. That's absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we no longer have a like if they blend together, we no longer have God and we
Yeah.
no longer have man. We have a third thing.
Exactly.
A weird mixture of the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no, that can't be. You can't have a weird mixture of the two because God can't be anything other than God, and he can't change,
Yeah.
or he's if he can change, he's not God, because fundamental to who God is that he cannot change.
Exactly.
So if you're talking about something that can change, that can morph into something else, we're not talking about God anymore. So yeah, the communicado idiomatum preserves the integrity of both natures by saying that each nature is held intact.
Yes.
But there's that principle of reduplication that we can posit. We can say that the person is doing something in both natures. So the person can act in the divine nature,
Yeah.
and the person can act in the human nature, and that's how we understand the things like before Abraham was I am.
Exactly.
He's acting. That is something that can only be predicated of God. Predicated means just said of God, but yet he doesn't know the day, or even he doesn't know the time of his return.
Yeah.
So wait a minute, how can he be God and not know the time of his return? Or even more clearly, he dies, right? On the cross, he really experiences human death.
Yeah.
And Paul says quite clearly that God alone possesses immortality. So how does one who possesses immortality die?
Exactly.
Because he has the nature of a human, and he dies according to his human nature.
Yeah.
And yet it is still the person who dies.
Yeah.
And otherwise, then we would not have a salvation for all of humanity.
Yeah.
There's something about the high value of the person, being that it is the God-man who dies, which creates the full atonement sufficient for all, because of the value of who he is. That value is attached to his deity.
Yeah.
So when he dies, it is the Son of God incarnate who dies. It's not as if the divinity leaves him at that point. It is God who, the Son, who dies.
Yeah.
But dies according to his human nature.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's and Wellum says it in the middle of the paragraph on page 438, and it's that principle of communicatio that helps us to be able to explain why that there's no contradiction in him dying and still being eternal.
Right.
In him being finite in his knowledge, yet still being omniscient.
Right.
So it's this principle that enables us to know that there is no contradiction.
Right.
There's the human, and then there's the divine, both acting
Yeah.
and interacting.
Yeah. Briefly then, the extra Calvinistica, as it is called, that as we, what is going on here, that even though we want to say that the person of the Son of God takes on human nature, we also want to say that there are things that the Son of God does, and he still continues to do, that cannot be executed through the human nature. So, the principle is that the finite cannot contain the infinite, and that we must recognize that that Jesus Christ is that when we talk about that the Son of God is upholding the universe by the word of his power, we don't have to have some really strange way of how he's doing that with his human words when he's on earth. We recognize that he is omniscient or omnipresent, even as he is contained in that human person. So we recognize both of those together, and we don't need to try to reconcile them. I remember I had a professor who didn't agree with this one time, it wasn't at where I went to my seminary training formally, but was talking to this guy, and he was trying to remember. He tried to say that how do we explain Jesus's omnipresence? How do we explain the Son of God's omnipresence when he is located in a and he said, well, I think we could try to say that he could decide to be anywhere. Well, you don't want to do that. You don't do that for two reasons. Because one, that's a really strange view of omnipresence at that point. And two, if we try to make it so that he can be omnipresent in his human nature, that's a very strange view of a human nature at some point. In what sense then is he still tempted in all ways like us if he has this human nature that could be anywhere at any time? Like you just sort of exist here, decide to exist there. He's no longer truly God and no longer truly man. And so we don't want to do that. We need to hold to the fact that he is doing things, the Son of God is doing things that cannot be contained in that human nature, even as he is truly existing in the human nature. So, well, I think that's enough for
very helpful explanation
for one time. Any closing parting words?
I just want to encourage students that yes, this section is tough. It's not easy to come across all these different terms. I would highly encourage you to have your smartphone or some theological dictionary beside you as you're going through this, because you don't want to just overlook things and skip and just say, I don't need to know that. No, challenge yourself by actually looking through each word and improve your theological understanding of a work as this. At the same time, I thought it was really helpful, at least for me personally, in being able to describe the distinctions and understanding Christ's role.
Great. Good. Well, look forward to seeing how the students summarize this and what they learned from that.
Absolutely.
Thanks.